A desperate escape. The thick alien jungle was alive with strange sounds, whispers of wind through glowing leaves, the chirps of unseen creatures, and the distant growl of something large. Lieutenant Mark Evans stumbled through the dense foliage, his breathing ragged and uneven. His uniform was torn, his left leg dragging behind him as blood oozed from a gash on his thigh. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not with it chasing him. Behind him, the sound of heavy footfalls crushed the silence. A deep, guttural growl followed, echoing through the air like a warning. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he risked a glance over his shoulder. He caught a glimpse of the predator, massive, reptilian, with glowing red eyes that cut through the darkness like searchlights. Its razor-sharp claws gleamed under the faint light of the twin moons above. Mark swallowed hard. His blaster was empty, useless now. He had dropped his communicator miles ago in a desperate attempt to lighten his load. No backup was coming. No cavalry. It was just him and the jungle. And the thing hunting him. His foot caught on a root, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot up his leg as he hit the damp soil. He groaned, trying to push himself up, but his arms felt like lead. The predator's growl grew louder, closer. He didn't have much time. As Mark struggled to move, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds, chirps, rustles, the hum of alien insects, all fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. It was as if the entire world knew what was about to happen. The predator emerged from the shadows, its massive form towering over Mark. Its scales shimmered, reflecting the faint bioluminescence of the jungle. Rows of sharp teeth curled into a snarl as it approached, each step deliberate and menacing. Mark closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. He thought about his family back on Earth, his friends, the life he would never return to. This was how it ended. Alone, in a place light years away from home, devoured by a creature he couldn't even name. And then, out of nowhere, the jungle roared. A deafening, primal sound tore through the air, shaking the ground beneath him. Mark's eyes snapped open as the predator froze, its head snapping toward the source of the noise. The roar came again, closer this time, followed by the thunderous sound of something massive crashing through the undergrowth. Before Mark could process what was happening, the predator was hit, hard. A blur of movement slammed into it, sending the beast sprawling to the side. Mark barely had time to register the figure now standing between him and the predator. She was tall, unbelievably tall, easily over 12 feet, with a powerful muscular frame. Her skin glowed faintly, a deep shade of emerald green that seemed to blend with the jungle around her. Sharp, angular features framed her face, but her eyes were unlike anything Mark had ever seen. They were bright, almost luminescent, and filled with a strange mix of ferocity and intelligence. The alien Huntress stood her ground, wielding a weapon that looked like a mix between a spear and an energy blade. She let out another roar, this one aimed directly at the predator. It hesitated, snarling back at her, but taking a step back. The two creatures circled each other, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. The Huntress moved with a predator's grace, her every step calculated. The predator lunged, claws extended, but she was faster. With a swift movement, she dodged to the side and brought her weapon down in a powerful arc, striking the beast across its side. Mark watched in awe, his pain and fear momentarily forgotten. The fight was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Raw, brutal, and almost beautiful. The Huntress didn't just fight. She dominated, her every move precise and purposeful. The predator let out a final, pitiful growl before collapsing to the ground. The Huntress stood over it, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. For a moment, Mark thought she might deliver the killing blow, but instead, she stepped back, allowing the predator to retreat into the jungle. Silence returned, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The Huntress turned to face Mark, her glowing eyes locking onto his. He froze, unsure of what to do. She tilted her head, studying him, and for the first time, Mark noticed the softer details in her expression. Despite her size and the raw power she had just displayed, there was something kind about her. As Mark struggled to sit up, the Huntress approached. He flinched, but she didn't attack. Instead, she crouched down, her movements slow and deliberate, and extended a hand toward him. Mark stared at her, his heart pounding. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't anything he could have prepared for. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The Huntress didn't answer, but the faint, almost reassuring smile on her face told him everything he needed to know. For now, he was safe. The Huntress's compassion. Mark woke to the sound of soft humming. It wasn't mechanical, more like a song, raw and haunting, echoing off the walls of the dimly lit cavern around him. His eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. The pain in his leg brought it all back. The predator, the hunt, the towering alien Huntress. He tried to sit up, but his body protested. That's when he noticed her. The Huntress was kneeling a few feet away, her back to him. She was working with her hands, her long, sharp fingers expertly mixing something in a glowing bowl. The faint green light illuminated the edges of her silhouette, highlighting her broad shoulders and elegant, almost graceful posture. For someone so massive, her movements were surprisingly delicate. Mark's breath hitched, and she turned instantly, her glowing eyes locking onto his. Her movements were quick but not threatening, like a predator who knew its power but didn't need to flaunt it. She tilted her head, studying him, as if deciding what to do next. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. "Where am I?" he croaked. The Huntress didn't respond, not with words. At least. Instead, she reached for the glowing bowl and approached him. Mark tensed as she crouched beside him, towering over him even at this level. Up close, he could see the intricate markings on her skin, natural patterns, like vines etched into her emerald green flesh. She held up a hand, palm open, a gesture that was surprisingly universal. "Stay still." Mark froze as she dipped 2 fingers into the glowing mixture and gently applied it to the gash on his thigh. A cool, tingling sensation spread through his leg, and the pain began to fade almost instantly. He stared at her, unsure if he should be relieved or terrified. You're helping me?" he asked, his voice shaky. She glanced at him, her expression unreadable, and then nodded. Just once. Mark didn't know what to say. He had seen so much death, so much violence, ever since he crash-landed on this alien world. Compassion wasn't something he had expected to find here, especially not from someone who looked like her. As she worked, Mark noticed the faint scars on her arms and hands. They weren't random. They looked like they told a story, a warrior's story. He wondered how many battles she had fought, how many lives she had taken. And yet here she was, saving his life. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice softer now. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a small device. It looked like a piece of advanced technology, sleek, smooth, and glowing faintly like everything else in this strange place. She pressed it to her throat, and when she spoke, her voice was deep and melodic, though slightly distorted by the translator. "You are not enemy," she said slowly, as if testing the words. Mark blinked. "Not enemy. Then, what am I?" She tilted her head again, her glowing eyes narrowing as she considered his question. Finally, she said, "Lost." Mark couldn't argue with that. Before he could ask more, the faint sound of a distant roar echoed through the cavern. The Huntress's head snapped up, her entire body tensing like a coiled spring. She moved to the entrance of the cave, her spear-like weapon in hand, and scanned the jungle outside. "What is it?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't respond. Instead, she held up a hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. The tension in the air was palpable. Mark could feel his heartbeat in his ears as he watched her. She was completely still, every muscle in her body taut, her eyes scanning the shadows. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the roar faded. The Huntress relaxed, but only slightly. She turned back to Mark and motioned for him to stay where he was. "Danger," she said, her voice low. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. Danger seemed to be the only constant in this place. As she turned back to the glowing bowl, Mark couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. She didn't owe him anything. If anything, he was a burden, a wounded stranger on an alien world. And yet she was risking her life to keep him safe. "Thank you," he said softly. The Huntress paused for a moment, her glowing eyes meeting his. For the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of something human in her expression, something warm, almost kind. She didn't say anything, but the faintest hint of a smile crossed her lips before she returned to her work. Mark lay back against the cool stone of the cave, staring up at the glowing crystals above. For the first time in days, he felt something other than fear. Hope. The jungle ambush. The silence was too perfect, too unnatural. Even Mark, who had spent only days on this alien world, could sense it. He sat at the edge of the cave, leaning against the cool rock wall, his leg feeling somewhat stronger thanks to the Huntress's glowing salve. Yet, a different kind of tension gripped him now, a deep primal awareness that something was wrong. The Huntress stood at the entrance, her towering frame outlined against the dim green light of the jungle. Her weapon was ready, the blade humming softly with energy. Her glowing eyes scanned the trees, her every muscle taut like a predator ready to pounce. Mark had no idea what she was listening for, but whatever it was, it terrified her. And that terrified him. Then it happened. A faint whirring sound pierced the silence, like the buzz of a mechanical insect. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder, sharper, closer. The Huntress hissed softly, a sound Mark hadn't heard from her before. She raised her weapon and motioned for him to stay back. "What is it?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer. Instead, she moved into the jungle, her steps soundless despite her size. Mark felt his chest tighten. Every instinct told him to stay put, to let her handle whatever was out there. But curiosity, and the gnawing guilt of being a useless bystander, kept him watching. The whirring grew louder, now accompanied by faint flashes of light flickering through the trees. It was then that Mark saw it, a small, hovering drone, sleek and metallic, with a glowing red core at its center. It floated lazily through the air, its surface shimmering as if cloaked in some kind of stealth field. Mark's breath caught. He recognized the design. It wasn't alien, not in the same way the Huntress or the jungle were. This was human-made, military-grade surveillance tech. Before he could process the implications, the drone stopped abruptly, its red core blinking as it scanned the area. It turned toward the Huntress, who was now crouched behind a massive tree, her weapon aimed directly at the machine. The tension snapped like a taut wire. The drone emitted a sharp, piercing noise, an alarm. The Huntress leaped from her hiding spot, hurling her spear with unerring precision. The weapon sliced through the air and struck the drone dead center, sending it crashing to the ground in a shower of sparks. Mark barely had time to breathe a sigh of relief before the jungle erupted into chaos. From the trees emerged figures, tall, armored, and deadly. They weren't human, but they weren't like the Huntress either. Their metallic exoskeletons gleamed under the faint light, and their weapons buzzed with energy. These were bounty hunters, Mark realized, and the Huntress was their target. She didn't hesitate. With a roar that sent shivers down Mark's spine, she charged at them. Her spear was back in her hands. How, Mark had no idea. And she moved with a speed and grace that seemed impossible for someone of her size. The first bounty hunter fell instantly, her spear slicing through its chest plate like paper. The second fired a shot, but she dodged it, closing the distance in a heartbeat and delivering a crushing blow to its head. Mark watched in awe, his body frozen in place. She was unstoppable, a force of nature. But there were too many of them. For every bounty hunter she took down, two more seemed to emerge from the shadows. And then they spotted him. Mark's heart sank as one of the bounty hunters turned its glowing eyes toward the cave. It raised its weapon, and Mark knew he was out of time. He tried to scramble to his feet, but his leg gave out, sending him crashing back to the ground. The hunter advanced, its weapon humming ominously. Mark braced himself, his mind racing for a way out. But before the hunter could fire, a massive shadow descended upon it. The Huntress. She slammed into the bounty hunter with the force of a freight train, her roar echoing through the jungle. The hunter crumpled under her weight, and she finished it off with a swift strike of her blade. "Go," she shouted, the translator around her neck crackling as it conveyed her words. Mark hesitated, his body frozen with fear and adrenaline. "Go," she roared again, pointing toward a narrow path that led deeper into the jungle. He didn't need to be told a third time. With every ounce of strength he could muster, Mark dragged himself to his feet and limped toward the path. Behind him, the sounds of battle raged on. The roar of the Huntress, the mechanical screams of the bounty hunters, the hum of energy weapons. He didn't look back. He couldn't. As he stumbled into the darkness of the jungle, Mark realized two things. First, the Huntress wasn't just protecting him. She was risking her life for him. And second, whoever had sent those drones and bounty hunters wasn't just after her. They were after both of them. Trust is tested. The jungle blurred past Mark as the Huntress carried him, her powerful strides cutting through the dense undergrowth like a predator on the hunt. She moved with terrifying speed, her glowing eyes fixed ahead, scanning for threats. Mark clung to her, his arms weakly gripping her shoulders, the alien texture of her skin cool and smooth against his fingers. He didn't have the strength to protest or question her anymore. Survival was all that mattered. The adrenaline coursing through his body couldn't fully drown out the chaos in his mind. The bounty hunters, the drones, the Huntress's ferocity, none of it made sense. Why was she risking her life to protect him? A stranger, a human. He was more trouble than he was worth, and yet here she was, carrying him through the jungle like he was something precious. The silence between them was deafening. Mark had tried to speak earlier, to ask her what their next move was, but she had simply placed a finger to her lips and kept running. He didn't need a translator to understand that this wasn't the time for questions. The terrain shifted as they approached a steep incline. The Huntress slowed, her breathing steady despite the effort. Mark, barely conscious, noticed the way the trees thinned here, their glowing leaves casting eerie shadows across the rocky ground. Where are we going?" he managed to whisper. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she adjusted her grip on him, careful not to aggravate his injured leg, and pointed ahead with her free hand. Mark followed her gesture and saw a faint glow in the distance, soft and warm, unlike the harsh bioluminescence of the jungle. "A sanctuary," the Huntress said, her voice low but clear. The translator around her neck crackled as it struggled to keep up with her alien tongue. Sanctuary. The word sounded hopeful, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that hope was in short supply on this planet. As they crested the incline, the glow grew brighter, revealing an ancient structure hidden within the jungle. It was massive, carved from black stone, and covered in vines that pulsed faintly with light. The architecture was both alien and strangely familiar, like something out of humanity's forgotten myths. The Huntress set him down gently at the entrance, her glowing eyes scanning the area. Mark winced as his injured leg hit the ground, but he bit back the pain. "This place," he said, his voice shaky. "What is it?" "Safe," she replied simply. She pressed her hand against the stone wall, and the structure responded. The vines pulsed brighter, and a doorway slid open with a soft hiss. The air inside was cool, almost sterile, and filled with the faint hum of alien machinery. Mark hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay outside. He had learned the hard way that safe was a relative term on this planet. "Go," she said, motioning for him to enter. Her tone left no room for argument. He limped inside, the smooth floor a welcome change from the uneven jungle terrain. The room was vast, lined with glowing panels and strange devices. It reminded him of a laboratory or a command center. The Huntress followed, her presence filling the space as she moved toward a console. She pressed a series of symbols, and a hologram flickered to life above the console. It was a map, intricate and detailed, showing the surrounding jungle. Red markers dotted the edges, slowly converging on their location. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "They're still coming," he said. The Huntress nodded. "They will not stop," she replied. He stared at her, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Then why are you helping me? You could have left me back there. I'm slowing you down." Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. She stepped closer, towering over him. And for a moment, Mark thought he had pushed too far. But then her expression softened, just slightly. "You are different," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "Not like them." "Them?" Mark frowned. "You mean the bounty hunters." She shook her head and pointed at the hologram. One of the red markers expanded, revealing a cluster of symbols that Mark couldn't read. "Humans," she said. Mark's blood ran cold. "Wait, you mean those bounty hunters? They're working for humans." The Huntress didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Mark felt his stomach churn. The drones, the tech, it all made sense now. The bounty hunters weren't just tracking her, they were tracking him. He sank to the ground, his mind racing. His own people were hunting him. Why? Was it because of the crash? Or was there something he didn't know, something they weren't telling him? The Huntress crouched beside him, her glowing eyes meeting his. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm, but reassuring. "Trust is difficult," she said, "but I will not leave you." Mark looked at her, searching for any hint of deception, but found none. She meant it. For reasons he couldn't understand, she had chosen to protect him, even at the risk of her own life. Before he could respond, a loud crash echoed from outside. The Huntress rose instantly, her weapon in hand, and moved toward the entrance. "Stay here," she commanded. Mark watched as the door slid shut behind her, leaving him alone in the sanctuary. His heart pounded as he stared at the hologram, the red markers inching closer. Trust was difficult, she had said. And now, he realized, it wasn't just her trust that was being tested. It was his own, the hidden enemy. The alien city unfolded before Mark like something out of a fever dream. Towering spires of black metal twisted into impossible shapes, their surfaces pulsing with veins of glowing light. The air was heavy, filled with a faint hum that vibrated in Mark's chest. It was alive, in a way. A city that breathed and watched. He could feel it. The Huntress led the way, her movements swift but deliberate. She didn't glance back at him, her focus entirely on the path ahead. Mark struggled to keep up, his injured leg slowing him down. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and reflective, almost like glass, and it made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Every step echoed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the city itself was listening. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice low. The Huntress finally stopped, turning to face him. Her glowing eyes softened slightly, but her expression was still unreadable. "Their city," she said simply, her words clipped by the translator. "Not ours." Mark frowned, glancing around at the alien architecture. "You mean the bounty hunters?" She nodded, gesturing to the towering structures around them. "Their hive." Mark's stomach churned. He had assumed they were running away from danger, not toward it. "Why are we here? This is suicide." The Huntress stepped closer, towering over him. Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. Safe place is gone. Only way through is here. Mark clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. Through. What does that even mean? What's waiting on the other side? She hesitated, as if the answer weighed heavy on her. Answers, she said finally. For you. For me. Before Mark could press her further, a loud mechanical click echoed through the air. The Huntress's head snapped toward the sound, and Mark felt his blood run cold. Shapes emerged from the shadows, sleek, armored figures with glowing eyes and weapons humming softly in their hands. Bounty hunters. The Huntress moved instantly, pushing Mark behind her and raising her spear-like weapon. The glow of its blade reflected off the glassy ground, casting sharp lines across her determined face. Mark's heart pounded as the lead bounty hunter stepped forward, its armor gleaming in the dim light. It was larger than the others, its movements slow and deliberate. Unlike the others they had encountered, this one seemed to exude authority. A leader, maybe. And then it spoke. Zale, it said, its voice deep and mechanical. Mark glanced at the Huntress, confused. Zale, he whispered. The Huntress didn't respond. She stood still, her weapon at the ready, her glowing eyes locked on the lead hunter. But Mark saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before. Hesitation. Zale, the bounty hunter repeated, taking another step forward. Its tone wasn't hostile, but there was something unsettling about it. Come home. Mark's eyes widened. Home. What is it talking about? The Huntress, Zale, tensed, her grip tightening on her weapon. Not my home, she growled, her voice distorted by the translator. The lead hunter tilted its head, almost curiously. You betray your kin for him, it said, pointing one long, clawed finger at Mark. For a human. Mark froze, his heart hammering. Betray her kin. What did that even mean? Zale didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her weapon raised, her expression hardening into one of pure defiance. I protect, she said, her voice firm. You destroy. The lead hunter let out a low, metallic chuckle. You think they would do the same for you. This one, it said, gesturing to Mark, will leave you the moment he can. Humans always leave. Mark felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to protest, to say it wasn't true, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he wasn't sure what he would do if the tables were turned. Would he risk his life for Zale the way she had for him? Zale didn't hesitate. He is not like them, she said firmly. The lead hunter's laugh deepened, echoing across the glassy streets. We shall see. With a snap of its clawed hand, the other bounty hunters raised their weapons. Mark instinctively ducked, his pulse spiking. But Zale didn't flinch. She spun her spear with deadly precision, the blade emitting a sharp hum as it cut through the air. Run, she said sharply, her glowing eyes locking onto Mark's. Now. No, Mark shot back. I'm not leaving you. Go, she roared, her voice carrying an urgency that left no room for argument. Before Mark could process what was happening, Zale charged the bounty hunters, her spear slashing through the air in a blur of light and motion. The lead hunter stepped back, barking orders as the others engaged her. Mark hesitated, torn between running and staying to help. But the sight of more bounty hunters pouring into the street made the choice for him. He turned and bolted, his injured legs screaming in protest as he sprinted through the alien city. Behind him, the sounds of battle rage, metal against energy, roars against mechanical snarls. As he ducked into an alley, his chest heaving, one thought consumed his mind. Zale wasn't just protecting him. She was fighting her own people to save him. And now he realized he couldn't abandon her. Not again. The Huntress's secret. The world around Mark was a chaotic blur. His legs burned, his lungs begged for air, and his heart pounded like a drum as he sprinted through the maze-like streets of the alien city. Every corner revealed towering spires, glowing pathways, and the constant, oppressive hum of machinery. The distant echoes of Zale's battle still carried through the air, but they were growing fainter. He felt the weight of guilt pressing down on him with every step. He was running again. The alley he'd ducked into opened into a vast plaza, its center dominated by a glowing, crystalline structure that seemed to pulse like a beating heart. Mark skidded to a halt, his eyes scanning the area. The plaza was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the crystal. It was unlike the rest of the city, pristine and untouched, as if it were sacred. Then he heard the voice. "You shouldn't have come here, human." Mark spun around, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its armor sleek and polished, with glowing lines that pulsed in sync with the crystal. It wasn't just another bounty hunter. This one carried itself differently, its movements deliberate, its gaze sharp and calculating. "I didn't exactly have a choice," Mark shot back, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. The figure tilted its head, studying him like a specimen under a microscope. "You are the reason Zale has turned against us. Do you understand what you've done?" Mark's fists clenched. "Turned against you. She's protecting me because you're trying to kill her. And me." A low mechanical chuckle escaped the figure. "Protecting you. Is that what she told you?" It stepped closer, and Mark instinctively took a step back. "She's protecting something much bigger than you, human. You're just convenient." Mark frowned, his confusion deepening. "What are you talking about?" The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You don't know, do you? She hasn't told you." "Told me what?" Mark demanded, his voice rising. The figure motioned toward the crystal in the center of the plaza. "That." Mark turned to look at the glowing structure, its light pulsing softly like a living thing. It was beautiful, but its presence felt heavy, as if it carried an immense, unknowable power. "That's what this is all about," the figure continued. "The crystal contains knowledge, centuries of it. It's the heart of this city, of our people. And Zale, she's one of its guardians." Mark's mind reeled. "A guardian? What does that have to do with me?" The figure laughed again, its tone colder this time. "You stumbled into something far bigger than yourself, human. Zale betrayed her oath the moment she decided to protect you. Do you know what that means?" Mark shook his head, his throat dry. "It means," the figure said, stepping closer, "she's no longer protecting the crystal. She's protecting you. And because of that, this city, this world, is vulnerable." Mark's chest tightened. None of this made sense. Zale hadn't told him anything about a crystal, or an oath, or why she was risking her life for him. He thought back to the times she had hesitated, the moments where she seemed lost in thought. She had been hiding something. "She's not the savior you think she is," the figure said, its voice quieter now. "She's a traitor. To us, to her people, and to everything she once stood for." Mark's anger flared. "That's not true," he snapped. "She's risking everything to save me. That doesn't make her a traitor. It makes her better than you." The figure's gaze hardened. "You really believe that, don't you? That you're worth saving?" Before Mark could respond, the air around them shifted. A roar echoed through the plaza, deep and guttural, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Zale emerged from the shadows, her weapon crackling with energy, her body covered in scratches and bruises. "Enough," she growled, her glowing eyes fixed on the armored figure. The figure turned to face her, its stance relaxed but ready. "Zale," it said, its tone almost mocking. "You should have stayed in the jungle. This place was never yours to return to." Zale's grip tightened on her weapon. "I didn't come for you," she said, her voice sharp. "I came for him." The figure glanced at Mark, then back at Zale. "You've already lost, Zale. The crystal knows. The city knows. And soon, he will know too." Zale didn't respond. Instead, she lunged forward, her spear slicing through the air with deadly precision. The figure dodged, its movements fluid and practiced. The clash of their weapons echoed through the plaza, each strike sending sparks flying. Mark watched, frozen in place. Zale was fighting with everything she had, but the figure was faster, stronger. He could see the exhaustion in her movements, the toll the constant battles had taken on her. And then it happened. The figure landed a blow, sending Zale crashing to the ground. She struggled to get up, her breathing labored, but the figure was already standing over her, its weapon raised. "Zale," Mark shouted, his voice breaking. Without thinking, he grabbed a piece of shattered metal from the ground and hurled it at the figure. It struck the armor with a loud clang, barely phasing it, but it was enough to distract the attacker for a split second. Zale seized the opportunity. With a roar, she drove her spear upward, striking the figure's chest and sending it stumbling back. Mark rushed to her side as she rose to her feet, her breathing heavy but steady. "We need to leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Mark nodded, but his mind was racing. The Huntress had secrets, big ones, and now he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. The final stand. The city pulsed with a cold, rhythmic hum, its glowing towers casting sharp, jagged shadows on the streets below. Mark clutched the stolen energy rifle in his hands, its weight unfamiliar but comforting. Beside him, Zale crouched low, her glowing eyes fixed on the massive structure at the heart of the city, a fortress-like spire encased in the same crystalline material as the glowing plaza they had left behind. "This is suicide," Mark muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of machinery. Zale didn't look at him. "Yes," she said simply, "but necessary." Mark frowned. He had heard the word necessary thrown around too many times during his military career. It was always the excuse for impossible missions, for sacrificing lives. But this time, he wasn't following orders. He was following her. The plan was reckless, almost laughably so. The fortress was the bounty hunters' command center, crawling with soldiers and advanced technology. But somewhere inside was the leader who had been hunting them. The same figure who had called Zale a traitor and nearly killed her in the plaza. Mark had seen enough movies to know how these things ended. Bad odds, heroic last stands, and more bodies than anyone wanted to count. But Zale wasn't human, and this wasn't Earth. The rules were different here. "You said this would give us answers," Mark whispered, glancing at her. "So what happens if we don't make it?" Zale finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her glowing eyes. Determination, maybe, or something softer. "Then we die," she said. "But the truth survives." Mark stared at her. "That's not comforting." "It's not meant to be," Zale replied, gripping her spear. "Stay close." Before Mark could respond, she moved. Her massive frame was surprisingly silent as she darted through the shadows, her spear glowing faintly in the dim light. Mark followed, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step brought them closer to the spire, closer to the enemy, and closer to the truth Zale had been hiding. The entrance was unguarded, which made Mark uneasy. The bounty hunters weren't careless, not after the chaos Zale had caused. If they weren't guarding the door, it meant they were waiting for them inside. Zale paused just before the entrance, her eyes scanning the area. "They know we're here," she said quietly. Mark tightened his grip on the rifle. "Great. Any other bad news?" Zale didn't answer. Instead, she pressed her hand against the crystalline wall, and the entrance slid open with a hiss. The air inside was cool and heavy, like stepping into the belly of a beast. The walls pulsed faintly, alive with the same energy that seemed to run through the entire city. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the strange, smooth floor. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the fortress was watching them, its walls breathing, its corridors shifting. Every twist and turn felt like a trap, but Zale moved with purpose, as if she knew exactly where they were going. Finally, they reached the central chamber. It was massive, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. At the center of the room stood a massive crystalline structure, larger than any they had seen before. It pulsed with light, its glow reflecting off the sleek, metallic floor. Surrounding it were rows of consoles and strange devices, their purpose beyond anything Mark could comprehend. And standing in front of the crystal was the figure from the plaza. "You made it," the figure said, its voice echoing through the chamber. It turned to face them, its armor gleaming in the crystal's light. "I'm impressed. Few survive this long." Zale stepped forward, her spear pointed at the figure. "This ends now." The figure laughed, the sound cold and mechanical. "You're still clinging to that pathetic hope, Zale. You think saving him will change anything." "It already has," Zale said, her voice steady. "He's the proof your system is broken." Mark blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "She hasn't told you, has she? About what you are, about why we've been hunting you." Mark's stomach tightened. He turned to Zale, but her gaze was fixed on the figure. "Zale, what is this thing talking about?" The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "You're not just a human, Mark. You're special, an anomaly. Your DNA, your biology, it's unique. A key to something we've been searching for, something Zale was supposed to protect." Mark's mind raced. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "You're lying," he said, his voice trembling. The figure gestured to the crystal. "See for yourself. The crystal holds everything. Our history, our knowledge, and the truth about you." Zale tightened her grip on her spear. "Don't listen to it, Mark. It wants to control you, to use you. And you don't." Mark shot back, his voice rising. "You've been hiding things from me since the beginning, Zale. How am I supposed to trust you?" Zale's gaze softened, just for a moment. "Because I didn't save you for what you are," she said. "I saved you for who you are." The chamber fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Mark stared at her, his anger fading into something more complicated. He didn't know if he could trust her, or anyone, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't do this alone. "Fine," he said, stepping forward. "Let's finish this." Zale nodded, and together, they turned to face the figure. The final battle had begun.